I've researched paranormal phenomena from South Africa to Brazil to Western Europe to China, places like this, and I've lectured too. But I've spent most of my life in Los Angeles, and I've grown to know the city, especially some parts of it, and I've encountered very interesting phenomena, which could be called paranormal, of course. And I'll tell you some of my experiences and maybe point people to certain areas of this great city, because it is a fascinating city. And I've already mentioned some of the interesting areas, in my opinion, such as Hawthorne. But I also want to turn your attention to the downtown area. Back in 1984, I worked in the downtown area, and I am a curious person, so I asked questions. And I knew somebody at the time who was an elevator mechanic, an experienced one. And he was about 50 years old at the time, I would say, back in 1984. He worked extensively in the Los Angeles area, and he knew the underground area of Los Angeles quite well. And I'm specifically referring to the tunnels. Those who have studied paranormal Los Angeles or just unusual Los Angeles know about the tunnels that have existed in our city that have been built up, whether by official government entities or private enterprises, and by the unofficial ones, such as the underworld in the 1920s. Also in the 1920s, the Pacific Red Car had some tunnels built, have been abandoned since then, and I believe there are about 270 tunnels that we know about, and about 11 miles altogether underground. There are some in the Bunker Hill area, some in the other parts of the Los Angeles. The mechanic that I refer to told me that once he was sent to the one of the long abandoned tunnels to do a special project, probably with the old elevator equipment, and he chanced into a side tunnel just by sheer chance when he was down below. He told me about the eerie feeling that he had when he was working down below, and when he did go into the side tunnel, he told me about the footprints that he had observed, made by a bipedal being, but not being human enough. He was not an uneducated person. He knew what he was speaking about, and he told me about the strange feeling that came over him and the fear that he experienced. He felt that something was watching him. I believe he never went back to that tunnel again, but he told me a few other stories, and that of course caught my attention, and I've collected as much as I can about the abandoned tunnels in Los Angeles. I know there are people who study this phenomenon, and they would know much more, but I didn't want to bring your attention to this story, and I didn't want it to go forgotten. Of course, those who study paranormal Los Angeles know about the 1934 story of the lizard, so-called lizard city, under the downtown area of Los Angeles, and the old Hopi, Arizona legends. When I went to college, Cal State Northridge, by the way, I have found an old book. It was very interesting. It contained legends from the Indians, from the Native Americans, from California and some other states. Very interesting, and I was amazed to find confirmation of the, let's call it ancient alien stories that I had read about in the writings of the Russian writers specializing in such research. We had a few of them in the former Soviet Union, and I'll talk about it later. So I wanted to bring your attention also to these stories of the Hopi Indians and the information they gave to Schufelt, the person who was in charge of the project to look for the abandoned lizard city under Los Angeles. The whole story to me was very interesting because of the time period where allegedly the catastrophe took place, and the fires engulfed and destroyed civilization, and people who were saved in the underground cities, and how they protected themselves. If you don't know this story, you should look it up, and maybe one day I'll tell what I know about it. But there are enough sources. Otherwise, I wanted to bring your attention to 3 other areas of Los Angeles, and I want to do it in this fashion. Little Tokyo is another part of the downtown Los Angeles. I've spent some years working there. I love the culture. I've learned to know the Japanese customs and made very good friends. Well, when I worked in Little Tokyo, I have to tell you that the paranormal phenomena was quite present there. You just had to know what to look for and what to ask for. So if you are on the streets of Little Tokyo, sometimes late evening, you can see some of the stories, or I should say creatures, that would be found in Japanese tales, or those who pretend to be such. It's a different part of Los Angeles than it used to be before Little Tokyo. And if you are curious enough, you will see and understand what I'm talking about. Also, keep in mind that at the time when I worked in that part of town, the LAPD used to have special units there too. And I think they had persons or police people who were doing investigations and might have seen much more than I have. It's just to keep an eye on that. It's a wonderful part of town. And if you ever want to learn about old Japan, you will. There are some other areas in Los Angeles that I found to be very interesting. One of them actually is in Tarzana, and it's Collins Street. In Tarzana, the stretch from Etiwanda to Reseda Boulevard. I don't want to tell you what part of the street exactly, but there are stories of those who had experienced it, of what I would call rupture of the time-space continuum. Somebody steps on a sidewalk in Tarzana and finds himself or herself somewhere else. This was very interesting, and I think it happened more than once. There are also other interesting details connected with Collins Street. I'm sure there are other areas of Los Angeles that would contain similar phenomena. It's just you have to ask questions and know what to look for. For example, Encino, there are a number of stories about strange, unusual, let's say, beings sighted in the hills of Encino. Also, I heard a report, very detailed report, of a gigantic cigar-shaped UFO that had been observed over Encino, I would say back in early 1980s. And the same person who told me that story, by the way, mentioned his neighbor who was a retired U.S. admiral who had seen quite a lot while serving in the U.S. military, in the Navy, especially the so-called USOs, which is one of the focus of my research, unidentified submersible objects. But you see, he would not talk about it, that U.S. admiral, because of the oath that he had given. That's the excuse he gave. But he told my acquaintance a number of interesting stories. Encino is also the area of the so-called apparitions, if I can call that phenomena correctly, because that's not my focus of research. But I knew somebody who had reported that when they were in an apartment, all of a sudden a human being appeared out of nowhere and walked across that apartment and vanished again. Also, there were stories about beings that were seen in the hills of Encino appearing from nowhere and disappearing somewhere else. Hawthorne I already mentioned before in my presentation, but I do want to call people's attention back to that town, those who are interested in paranormal phenomena. And if they ask questions, they'll find out much more. So I'll leave tonight at this, and I do want to mention that I'd like to speak about Brazil in my future presentation, because it's one of the most interesting countries in terms of the paranormal phenomena, and I'll share you some of my research. Thank you and good night.